Welcome back for another exciting lesson in Visual Basic. Today's lesson is going to go over timers, the form load event, radio buttons, and checkboxes. Okay. So a lot of times it becomes necessary in a program to execute something at regular intervals. Maybe you want to write something to a file, maybe you want to check sensors, something like that. We use a control called a timer for this. The timer has an event called a tick, which goes off at regular timed events. So let's do an example where we create a program that has a timer and updates a label with the current time on the screen. Basically, we're going to make a little clock program. So we'll go over to Visual Basic. We will create a new project, always the Windows Forms app. Here we go. Stretch out my window, or excuse me, my form. And I'll come down in my toolbox to the timer. I'll drag one of these onto the form. So you can see it doesn't have a lot of properties to it. We could change the name. The enabled function is how you turn the timer on and off. So maybe you want to suspend operation while you do something. You can set enable to false and the tick events will stop occurring. When you set it to true, the tick events will start happening again. The interval. Okay, this is how long between tick events, and it's in milliseconds roughly. So if I go with the default every 100 milliseconds, I would execute my tick event. I'm going to turn that up to 1,000. So we're going to have an event once every second. Okay, and as always, let's put a label on the screen so we have something to send output to. And I'm going to double click the timer so that it creates the most common event associated with the timer. There we go. And I'm just going to do something simple. So let's say label 1 dot text equals date dot now. And I'll hit F5 to compile it and run it. Whoops, we have a problem. So let's go back and debug it and see what happened. If I come to the timer, you can see enabled was set to false. So let's fix that. We'll turn that to true and run it again. Now it does exactly what you think it would do. It's putting the date in the label, and every second it updates and rewrites the label text. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Now, we could have gotten around that problem if we had set all of the startup conditions in the program before we began execution. And you can do that with something called the form load event. This is where you put all your startup housekeeping. So I'm going to double click on the form itself, right on form 1. And you can see it creates an event called form 1 load. This is where I can put all my startup stuff. So maybe if I need to initialize variables or open a file to write to or check that a peripheral is attached, anything like that, I can do all of that in the form load event. So to make sure I don't have the initial problem that I had, I'm going to say timer 1 dot enabled equals true. Okay, so now my timer's turned on, and I'm going to say timer 1 dot interval equals 1000 milliseconds. And I'll just put a comment next to it saying that's in milliseconds. And now we'll run it, make sure that it still runs. Now we don't have to worry about how the initial properties were set, because form load is going to take care of all that for me. Okay, so that's pretty jazzy. So now let's move on. Let's talk about something called a checkbox. Back to design mode, I'll move this up, give us a little room to work with. And let's put a checkbox on the screen. A checkbox is just an input device which allows the user to select an option at runtime. And we can have many of these on the screen. So I'm going Control C, Control V, so that I can just paste a bunch of them on. I'll hit Control V again. And let's press F5, we'll run it. Now you can see I can have any number of those checkboxes checked. You know, maybe I'm going to use them to turn on a light, or maybe I'll use them to turn on a pump, or start data logging, something like that. That's the kind of thing that you can use a checkbox for. So let's look at how we're going to code this thing. So the event that's created in the checkbox is checkbox changed. So whenever I check it or uncheck it, it's going to come in and do this event handler. So let's go back. We'll create another label. So I'm going to copy and paste this to create a label 2. Go back to the event handler for checkbox 1. And I'm going to say if checkbox 1 oops, command wrong. Dot checked equals true, then label 2 dot text equals checkbox 1 is checked. And if it's not, I'll say else. Checkbox 1 is not checked. Okay, let's run this. So here's label 2 up here, which I was just writing to. And I'll click on checkbox 1. Not checked is checked. So that's great. You know, we could write event handlers for all of these to do different things. And we could have any number of them checked or unchecked. But what happens if you get to the situation where you want something that's exclusive. Maybe you have something like a radio tuner. You can only have one station playing. So you could have a bunch of presets and you only want one active at any one time. Well, believe it or not, that's actually called a radio button. That's what Windows calls it. So let's end this. Come back to our project. I'm going to move these over so we have some room. And let's put a couple radio buttons on the screen. Radio button 1. I'll put them right next to the checkbox because I want you to be able to see how the operation of each compare. So I'm going to copy and paste. Paste again. So now I have 3 radio buttons. And let's see, I'll put another label on. Copy, paste. There's label 3. So as always, I'm going to double click radio button 1 and it writes the event handler. Radio button 1. So we can use the exact same philosophy that we used for the checkbox. Let me do an if statement. If radio button 1 dot checked is true, then label 3 dot text equals okay, so if the button is checked, it's going to send radio button 1 is checked to label 3. And if radio button 1 is not checked, it's going to say radio button 1 is not checked and send it to label 3. So after all that wordiness, let's run it and look at the differences. So I just clicked radio button 1. Notice that with the radio buttons, only one can be active. So it's a lot like your car radio. If you use the presets, the radio can only play one station at a time. If I come back over to the checkboxes, I can have any number checked or unchecked with those. So that's the crucial difference between radio buttons and checkboxes. Okay, so that's really cool. But what if I want to have multiple sets of radio buttons? Maybe I have a bunch of different functions where I want to choose one option for each function. So this gets into the topic of containers. Let's end this. If I use a group box to contain my radio buttons, drag one of these onto the screen. I'm going to paste my radio buttons into the group box. Yeah. And I could have something like, let's change the text on group box 1 to my radio. And radio button 1. Oops, my bad. WOKQ. WRKO. And WB108 for those of you who like radio in New York City. So now I have this, and I can copy and paste this entire structure. So I'm going to copy and paste. And in this container, I'm going to call this my CD tracks. And I'll choose something thoroughly modern, like the Bee Gees. Creedence, and the Beatles. Showing my avant-garde taste. Now let's run it. So again, I can choose any number of checkboxes I want. Obviously, I need to update the code. And these boxes become mutually exclusive only to their contents. Okay. Very important idea. So if I need to fix this text, and I can just copy, oops. I just need to copy this, excuse me, cut it, put it down here. I'll get rid of this event handler. Now my functions are working properly again. Okay, so that is the concept of radio buttons and containers in a nutshell. And that is all the important stuff for this lesson. So thank you for watching.